Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for coming to the Animals and Society Colloquium that we are hosting today. Before I introduce the talk, I just want to tell you a little bit about the colloquium series. This is a series that's being hosted between the Animals and Society section of the American Sociological Association and the Animals and Society Institute. If you are a sociologist, I would encourage you to join the ASA and be a part of our group, but anyone can be a part of ASI and can be on their mailing list to find out about great events like this and other great academic and some non-academic resources as well. And they also host a webpage that I'm going to put the link up for in the chat right here, and you can get past recordings from this event today is being recorded. It'll be up there in the future, and you can see some of our past colloquiums. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gayla Argent to introduce ASI to you.
Hello, all. Yes, I am the Human Animal Studies Program Director at ASI, and where my work focuses on forwarding and promoting the field of human animal studies, which deals with human-animal relationships. ASI manages two journals, the Journal of Applied Animal Welfare Science and Society and Animals, and a book series with Brill on human animal studies. We also have a variety of resources, and I will put the link up as soon as I finish here, for students, faculty, and practitioners who deal with human animal studies and human animal relationships.
Thank you. And my name is Carol Glasser, and I'm chair of the Animals and Society section of the ASA, and I help to organize this series. Just a little bit about the format for today. We have it in a meeting format because we will have about half an hour at the end for Q&A, but do know that we are recording. So if you don't want your face shown or anything, just if you ask a question, don't turn on your camera. But if you're comfortable with your face being shown, then feel free to turn on your camera if you have a question. What we're going to do is have Izzy present for the first half and then open it up to Q&A. If you have questions or comments while the presentation is going on, feel free to pop them up in chat. And if you don't want to verbally ask any questions at the end of the Q&A, I will be moderating the chat. So I will try to keep my eye on that so that any questions, if people don't raise their hands, can get in the queue as well. I ask that everybody try to stay muted while our speaker is speaking. So with that, why don't I introduce today's talk and today's speaker? Today's talk is called Animal Cultures, a Paradigm for Determining What Matters to Animals. Our speaker is Issy Clarke. Izzy is not an academic, but unexpectedly a sports broadcaster who has worked primarily in soccer for the past 30 years. However, she grew up in the country with a small holding and has always counted various non-humans among her closest friends. She started a master's program in ethics in 2020, but found the course matter too human-focused, and so she left the course and has been working on her dissertation idea as an independent scholar. Izzy volunteers for the Wildlife Trust in the UK and has made films to promote Paws Rescue Qatar. So with that, I will turn today's meeting over to Izzy.
Thank you very much, Carol. And I'll share my screen. We have practiced this, so in theory, it should work perfectly. There we go. First of all, I'd like to say a big thank you. Thank you to those of you who are attending and who watch in the future, and especially to Gayla for originally letting me know about this colloquium, and for Carol and Lisa for organising it. I really appreciate the opportunity. And the other thing I must do is apologise for two slightly neurotic cats. I'm out of the house a bit more than usual at the moment, and I didn't want to shut them out of my room. And I figured that this was one occasion where I could put the cats first. So I hope that you'll understand that. So in this presentation, I'll be seeking to persuade you to consider animal cultures whenever your work addresses the needs and interests of animals or the relationship between animals and humans. One point I ought to make clear at the start, as Carol mentioned, this is an exploration and it takes a multidisciplinary approach, drawing upon various areas of study in which I'm not an expert. I must acknowledge here that Gay Bradshaw has looked through this presentation and offered some advice, which I've taken to strengthen the scientific foundation for my claims. But this is my work, and all mistakes are mine. I'm not an expert at anything. Perhaps my liminal and borderline position on the outskirts of various fields has led me to place value and make meaning in a way that might seem unconventional. Nevertheless, during the course of this presentation, I wish to lure you into my unconventional way of seeing, but I assure you this is all founded on data drawn from a vast array of ethologists, biologists, and other researchers. First off, perhaps I should explain why I'm focusing on wild animals, especially given that I'm presenting to a group interested in relationships between humans and non-humans. Well, I contend that we are in relationship with wild animals in that we affect all of them through our tentacular and wide-ranging impact on all Earth's ecosystems. That only 1% of the Earth's mammalian biomass is made up of wild animals, with large numbers of animal species critically endangered, functionally extinct or extinct in the wild, that there has been an average 69% decline in the relative abundance of monitored wildlife populations around the world between 1970, the year of my birth as it happened, and 2018, suggests that for far too long, these animals have been granted far too little consideration. And even when we do consider them, it's often in terms, just as in this paragraph, of mere numbers, not actual lived experience. This presentation offers a starting point for addressing that lacuna. We'll begin with a broad and expansive conception of animal cultures. In addition, I'll suggest how humans can gather sufficient verifiable data to generate a good enough understanding of a population's culture. These are just suggestions, but I hope that they offer a suitable starting point. He's trying to catch a spider. I'll then add to the basics, demonstrating that cultures constitute a way of being and of knowing. Then it's time to see what all this means for our relationships with animals. As a result of this process, I concluded and will argue that animal cultures, not just animal individuals, should be protected. So what are animal cultures? When we talk of culture regarding humans, we're often considering artifacts, cathedrals and paintings, or even books or computer records and musical scores. That so much of our culture is reified can obscure awareness of cultures that are reliant on embedded, embodied, and enacted information, and on information that's passed from individual to individual. For that reason, in discussing whale cultures, Hal Whitehead and Luke Rendell offered a broad definition. Information or behaviour shared by community, which is acquired from conspecifics through some form of social learning. For ethologists, it's hard to prove that something is cultural, how to extract nurture from nature. Because there's no simple algorithm for this, claims that something is cultural with regard to animals are always subject to dispute. However, with humans, we don't seem to use the same rules. With humans, we're inclined to say that something's culture, with animals, not so much. Caroline Schluppe and Carol P. van der Scheek suggest that by applying the same standards to animals as to humans, we would see that animal cultures are far more widespread and pervasive than commonly thought. So let's try to substantiate this. In 2012, a group of eminent neuroscientists at Cambridge University announced that the scientific weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. All vertebrates, neuroscientists assert, have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviours. This paragraph is the opening of Non-Human Animal Nations, Transforming Conservation into Wildlife Self-Determination by Jessica Rizzolo and Gay Bradshaw. Moving on and using the same source, elephant PTSD demonstrated that non-humans have a psyche comparable to that of humans, and that what we know about human minds and brains applies to elephants and vice versa with equal rigor. The field of trans-species psychology was originated and developed by Gay Bradshaw, who insists that bidirectional inference is scientifically supported and ethically important. This leads me to suggest that if we would assume that something was cultural were humans doing it, why not make the same inference for animals? Now, much of what I'm going to define as culture could have been classified as mere behaviour. Yet those such as Barbara Smuts, Jane Goodall, Mark Beckhoff, Carl Safina and Lucy Rees take a less rigidly dualistic view. They may regard the mind of the animal subject as that of a human subject as something mostly mysterious, but they are willing to infer emotional state, knowledge, decision-making, and so on. Through a thorough exploration of the fieldwork of contemporary researchers and a similarly open-minded take on older texts, I believe that it would be possible to see the framework of a culture at least. I believe that we can make scientifically sound inferences. We might regard this as subjective knowledge, but inferences are an approved form of the scientific inquiry. One example I came across recently was in David Mick's book, Wolf Island, concerning his long study of the wolves and moose of Ile Royale. He says that the first time a moose faced him off and stared at him, rather than fleeing or charging, he thought the moose looked stupid. He writes that it took him 18 months to establish what the moose was doing. Patience and open-mindedness allowed him to infer what was going on as a cultural adaptation developed by moose in their relationship with predators. There's no sort of specifically verifiable data there. He inferred that over the course of his long study. Well, let's get back to cultures then. And here I want to expand on that rather abstract, broad definition. So I would suggest that cultures include shared socially learned information and behaviour for group living in a specific population. This includes social structures, family units, codes of behaviour, which you could call morality, mating behaviour, parenting methods, play, and modes of communication, or language. Note also that the concept of a group doesn't require that the animals live in a troop or a herd or a pack. Animals usually considered asocial, like tigers, leopards, and bears, can be seen to live in a spatially separated group in that they do communicate through scent markings, for example, with conspecifics and commune with conspecifics far more often than was previously thought. Cultures also include shared socially learned information and behaviour necessary for survival. This includes hunting and foraging techniques, the use of medicinal plants, predator avoidance strategies, migration routes, and tool use. Of course, data has to be interpreted, and these areas of contention are important and very relevant to the matter of defining cultures and verifiability. Where we see competition or aggression, is that really what's going on? It could be that we're interpreting data according to our unconscious schema, a capitalist, individualistic, homo economicus take that may be obscuring the reality of the situation about concerning beings who do not share our cultural preconceptions. As an example, John A. Livingston takes the view that highly social animals are inclined towards conciliation, which is essential for group living, and that some system determining who is first to, say, drink from a pool is inevitable, and it may not be experienced by the individual animals as a psychologically harmful failure to respect their intrinsic rights as individuals. This, you might suggest, could be supported by Bernd Heinrich's finding that ravens, low in the social hierarchy, did not have higher indices of stress than dominant ravens. Likewise, Barry Lopez, in agreement with wolf researcher David Mick, explains that the concept of alpha wolves is wrong-headed. Those who've studied wolves in unstressed environments have not witnessed dominance. Instead, they've seen members of a group following an experienced leader, often an older female, when the pack is seeking elusive prey or a denning site. Young females, meanwhile, are often the best hunters as they're lighter and faster, so they may lead the hunt. Lopez describes the social structure as dynamic and responding to skill and experience in various situations. Are we basing our research on data gathered in artificial situations? Yes, as Lucy Rees points out, you will see aggression in many domestic horses, but that's because they're not able to live in a way that's amenable to them as free-ranging herbivores with little competition for food, instead and existing in fairly stable family groups. Are we basing our findings on data concerning stressed animals? For example, Thelma Rowell suggests that dominance hierarchies are responses to stressful conditions, such as habitat loss and fragmentation, hunting and conflict with humans, and that internecine aggression is pathological. As Gay Bradshaw writes, neither evolutionary biology, including its offshoot, evolutionary psychology, nor ethology has taken into account animal psychological vulnerability as a relevant factor in explaining intraspecific killing. It may be that in many cases now we're observing cultural breakdown, not culture per se. Of course, I accept that all this makes definitions of an animal's culture difficult. All we can do is perform the best possible fieldwork with open minds. Our analysis will never be perfect, but we can, I hope, gather sufficient data and analyse it generously enough to have a cultural understanding that, as Winnicott said of mothers, is good enough. Oops, sorry about that. That's my crow friend. This has taken us through a relatively conventional view of animal cultures, and then suggested that we can perhaps do better, get a good enough framing through research and analysis that is self-reflexive, humble, empathic, and performed with attentive love. By which I mean, as Eva Meyer writes, quoting Simone Weil, to get to know other animals, we need to move beyond our own motivations and actually pay attention to them. To pay attention also means not immediately trying to understand them from our perspective, but rather taking the time to look at them until the light suddenly dawns. In this presentation, I'm seeking to encourage you to look with, not look at, animal cultures. This is an attempt to discover what matters to the animals themselves, rather than to attribute what matters from our position, or even from a neutral position. In attempting to look with animal cultures, I developed a list of what animal cultures may provide. Of course, not all aspects are relevant to all cultural groups at all times, but I seek to offer a menu of potential benefits and possible characteristics. All this I've argued at far greater length in an unpublished paper, and I'm happy to pass it on if people are interested. For now, I just ask you to look through this list and give me the benefit of the doubt. Just a note on the first item on the list, adaptability and resilience. This functions at both an individual and a group level. For the latter, for example, consider the sharing of new knowledge in a changing environment demonstrated by commensal animals. Birds swiftly learn and pass on to family first and then friends, as shown in Oxford University studies of great tits in Witham Woods, information about human-supplied food sources. At an individual level, a superb case study can be found in Developmental Context Effect on Bicultural Post-Trauma Self-Repair in Chimpanzees, a paper by Bradshaw, Capaldo, Lindner and Glow, which shows that chimpanzees with a secure cultural background recover far better from trauma than those without. These further points are critical, stressing firstly that culture is not just skin deep, nor is it purely about psychological well-being, that the habitat is vitally important and that each member matters as an individual. There is no preferring group over individual here. I'm saying that both matter. What you begin to see is that a culture could be seen as a population's DNA, containing all the information that enables the population to become itself, while also being plastic, just as genes are switched on and off by environmental factors, and adaptable as it evolves. Every aspect of it is important, though not necessarily all the time, and you can't just slice in or out an individual gene without impacting the whole. And finally, with the line about sovereignty, I'm using the term as it's presented by Donaldson and Kimlicka in Zoopolis. I'm arguing that in order for wild animals to be self-sufficient, they need their culture. It's helpful here to consider the concept of the Umwelt, a term originally coined by Jacob von Uexküll. It refers to the understanding of the world generated by an animal-specific sensorium, or various different senses. Von Uexküll did not exalt the human world over that of other animals. Instead, he treated the concept as a unifying and leveling force. He also insisted that in order to understand other animals, we need to have a sense of their Umwelten, which will be significantly different from our own. There can be no doubt that a fundamental contrast prevails everywhere between the environment which we see spread around animals and the Umwelten that are built up by the animals themselves and filled with the objects of their own perception. The key lesson here is that all Umwelten are limited. They limit what we know through experience. The very real danger is that we can believe that that's all there is to know. For this is where a dangerous form of anthropomorphism sneaks in. We forget about other Umwelten and frame animals' lives in terms of our senses rather than theirs. I believe that this is what we're inclined to do culturally. We frame animals' lives in terms of our cultural Umwelten rather than theirs. This is what leads me to believe that culture, entangled as it is in all these population-specific ways of being, relating, and knowing, should be considered as a system, not a list. As Carolyn Merchant puts it, no element of an interlocking cycle can be removed without the collapse of the cycle. No, the parts themselves thus take their meaning from the whole. Each particular part is defined by and dependent on the total context. The cycle itself is a dynamic, interactive relationship of all its parts, and process is a dialectical relation between part and whole. Consider just for a moment an old-growth forest. Over time, complexity, redundancy, and cooperation lead to an expansive resilience. Remove the polypore fungus, and sapsuckers can't make nests because the trees aren't soft enough. No nests, no sapsuckers, and that's bad news for all the other creatures that eat the sap, from insects to squirrels. No sapsucker nesting holes is bad news for chickadees and all the other birds and animals that rely on woodpecker and sapsucker holes for their nests. Fewer birds would mean more insects and more harm than to trees. Just one change can tip a balance. 3 or 4 is the recipe for collapse. With culture, in addition to the physical processes and interactions, such as I've mentioned there in the case of the forest, there are levels of affect, meaning, value, relationship. Barbara Nosk writes, I think this is beautiful. Culture can be seen as constituting a pool of feeling and thought to which individuals contribute and from which they draw in various ways and degrees. In discussing culture with biologists, I've often noticed how hard it is for them to understand culture as a dialectical process of constituting and being constituted, rather than as a complex of adaptive mechanisms. Okay, so how does all this relate to our interactions with, relationships with, or management of wild animals? Cultures should be considered in such activities as translocation, captive breeding, de-extinction, management of hybridization, and conservation grazing or rewilding. I've discussed this in a longer version of my paper, but due to time constraints, I'll just make a few points. The wolves at Yellowstone were largely unrelated individuals captured and flown in, removed from their cultural nexus. Despite their success in numbers, and they have been a great success, and I'm not criticizing the Yellowstone project in the slightest, there is far greater inter-wolf violence in Yellowstone than in Alaska, where wolves, though persecuted, live in family groups. The elephants in some South African reserves were trucked in as youngsters after seeing their families shot from a helicopter. These young male elephants, without appropriate family life in the natal group, and then later in a group of mature males, came into must about 10 to 15 years earlier than is normative, and they raped and killed 100 rhinos. This behavior was previously unknown in elephants. Now take captive breeding. Sadie Jane Ryan cites the case of a female gorilla who not only could not parent, but could not copulate, as she'd never had the opportunity to learn how gorillas mate. Captive bred parrots create their own dialect, and when released, are not accepted or understood by wild parrot communities. A captive raised orca, Keiko, was released into the world, but he was afraid of the orca community that greeted him. He didn't understand orca social behavior and fled back to the humans in a nearby boat. Captive raised animals may be as lacking in the cultural knowledge and social behavior of their conspecifics as our animal raised human children. As a dramatic contrast, the human elephant mothers at the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust understand elephant families and act as surrogates for orphan babies. Their success in raising young elephants who can return to wild living as cultural animals is reliant on an appreciation of elephant culture. Likewise, Charlie Russell understood the culture of brown and grizzly bears and was able to act as a bear mother, raising traumatized orphans, teaching them what berries to eat, how to catch salmon, how to den, even how to interact with other bears. So good was he that a wild brown bear in Kamchatka used him as a nanny for her cubs when she went off foraging. In these cases, the humans actually weren't academics using verifiable analyses and research data. They were people who paid attention, were open, humble, and willing to learn from the experts in animal culture, the animals themselves. The proof lies in the relationships, the human-animal relationships, in which the human was open to the animal's cultural needs. Now, at least we can study wild elephants and brown bears to get a good enough understanding of their culture. What about de-extinction? There is zero cultural knowledge about mammoths and precious little about passenger pigeons. Animal cultures always include, embrace, impact, and are impacted by, are in systems relationship with other species. The example of elephants killing rhinos shows that elephant culture matters for rhinos. But think too of alarm calls that spread among prey species. Think about wolves and ravens cooperating, groupers and moray eels, badgers and foxes or coyotes hunting together. The way mammal migrations in the savannah function, zebras, then wildebeest, then antelope, who each prepare the way for the other, enabling each to get the vegetation best suited for the species. It's like Russian dolls. Cultures impact and are impacted by habitat, ecosystem, other life forms, mineral and chemical processes. And of course, as climate change shows us, we're having an impact way, way beyond actual interactions. We've always impacted animal cultures, though in the past, perhaps our relationships with at least some species were mutually beneficial. Let's address some examples. Many of you will be familiar with the interactions between humans and honey guides, the birds that lead people to bees' nests, between artisanal fishermen and dolphins, and between human hunters and ravens. These are cases of the co-evolution of cultures. Much of this may now seem lost, and instead, relationships with wild animals are often riven with conflict and violence. Of course, we humans kill them for food, for trophies, for management, and they can harm us. However, on that score, it's worth bearing in mind that in a significant number of cases, for example, cougars, African lions, and elephants harming humans, wild predators eating livestock, the breakdown of animal cultures plays a role. Trophy hunting, habitat loss and fragmentation, increased disturbance, loss of food resources, overcrowding, and so on, all negatively impact the dynamics of wild animal populations. On a more hopeful note, consider commensal species, and specifically the matter of feeding garden birds. I've been feeding the birds in my garden for many years. I've read research on it, and there may be some negative impacts in that certain species may thereby outcompete other rarer species. But given the dramatic decrease in UK bird numbers over recent years, the activity seems better than not feeding them. Very quickly, the birds knew my routines and would adapt their behaviour to incorporate foraging in my garden at certain times. In the UK, the robin, which is a different bird from the American robin, has always been very closely related to people. Robins used to rely on boars in winter, turning over the hard earth and exposing earthworms, which robins love. With the loss of boars, we killed them all off, robins realised that gardeners could be equally useful. Pictures of robins often show them perched on the handle of a spade. They'll follow you around the garden. We have become part of robin culture. As David Attenborough says in his series Wild Isles on British wildlife, to a robin, a human with a spade is a pig on 2 legs. Anyway, the male robin in my garden will eat from my hands. He won't come if I don't look at him and call him. He requires the relationship which enables him to determine trustworthiness. And it's up to him. If he's on singing duty, which he often is these days, I'm completely irrelevant. In the co-created part of our culture, we're both completely free to determine if we interact. This small example shows that cultures, ours and theirs, can be porous, plastic, shape-shifting, and evolving into something mutually beneficial, where we share a part of our epistemes without asserting power over each other. I'll let you read this quote, which I really like. It's from Matthew Clarke, and it offers a vision for the future, for human-animal relationships in the future. This bit at the end. How might we transform our ways of life to ensure that they and we are able to flourish jointly? We might further wonder, what kinds of individuals would we have to become to be worthy of such relationships? What kind of subjective transformations might we have to undergo in order to live lives that do justice to this larger sense of community? I also like these framings, which I took from Deborah Bird-Rose's Wild Dog Dreaming, Love and Extinction. Becoming with. Living and non-living beings are mutually interdependent. Our lives are lived in connection. Each becoming depends on our relationships with other living and non-living beings. And world making. In becoming with others, we bring forth worlds of action and meaning and varied possibilities for life and death. Overall, I'm suggesting that an understanding of cultures can help us to become better with other animals, and that this process is world making. Just before I finish, I'd like to make one point which is important in my framing of this discussion. We're already world making, but we're shaping everything according to what looks now like a homogeneous, simplistic, and dysfunctional model where only one culture has hegemony, ours, by which I guess I mean the weird culture, Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. Or perhaps it's better to say a culture that is competitive, individualistic, and values only that which can be sold. As we do so, we're losing not just species, but ways of being. Songs of birds whose numbers are depleted lose their complexity. Cultures of persecuted animal populations collapse. We're destroying not just biodiversity, but the diversity of ways of being, ways of knowing, and ways of relating. This comment from a review in the Guardian newspaper of Colin Tudge's wonderful book, The Secret Life of Trees, sums this up rather well. Tudge maintains that in the natural world, each individual must take everything else into account in order to survive. For far too long, we've taken account only of what we need, what we want, and what we know. But animal cultures show us what animal populations need, want, and know. I believe we should take all that into account. All animal cultural groups, I believe, merit the space, freedom, and opportunity to evolve their cultures, enabling their greater resilience. Many of these groups may need and want no interaction with us. They should have that negative liberty. Some may co-create shared cultures, and that process, in my view, should be equitable, and how world-making it would be. Yes, this is a big ambition, which would demand great change on our part, as Matthew Clarke suggested. But for too long, we've been utterly selfish bullies, bigots, users and killers in our dealings with wild animals. It's about time we tried to have human-animal relations that at the very least enable coexistence with the vast numbers of other cultural groups on this planet. In my view, we owe them not just that, but reparation. So here's my takeaway. Animal cultures encompass the most critical aspects of an animal's existence: what she does, where she belongs, and who she is. If we're to form a fair multi-species world, then we have to respect the core means by which each animal becomes who she is, namely her culture. Oops, one page too far. Please do contact me. I've got a lot of information outside what you've heard here. I don't know that I can take this anywhere usefully. I'm not an academic, and I'm really reaching out for some help or for someone to take this forward. So do contact me. And here is some selected material from my bibliography. I'll stop the share now.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. So now we can open up the floor. We still have 25 minutes left, so we can open up the floor to some conversation and discussion. Just a reminder that this is being recorded, so if you don't want your face to be recorded, just don't turn your camera on. Otherwise, feel free to. You can either type your questions up in the chat, or you can use the hand raise reaction, and then I can call on people as you have questions. I have a question that's that I can start us with. It's actually unrelated to the talk, but something that came up for me was the depth of the work that you've done is extensive, and you mentioned that you're not an academic. So I wonder how you find yourself navigating sort of the institutional barriers to accessing all of this great information, and where you are finding your audiences for these things, because I think it's so important that you're doing the work that needs to be done, even though you're not embedded in an institution. And there's probably other people here who are interested in how that works.
Well, for probably a year and a half, or two academic years, I was doing a part-time master's. So during that time, I was able to access scientific papers. Now, I didn't come up with this idea until quite close to the period at which I stopped doing the master's. But just before I stopped, I thought, but I had already written all the papers I'd written until that point were about animals. And so I had some papers, but I went through those and looked through the references on those papers to try and find anything that would be useful. But I also, I've spent quite a lot of money on books and I've always read a great deal about animals, and I spend a lot of time with them. So I have had access to some scientific material. I've also used things like ResearchGate and so on, where you're able to get in touch with the academics and ask if you can use their paper. And a couple of times people have been kind enough to get back to me. And so I've done that. I have presented a more, because I was studying philosophy, I was originally putting it more as an ethical argument for the ethical importance of considering animal cultures. And I presented that version of the paper to a group of Dutch ethicists whom I'd met disparately through doing the masters. And again, they said, as you said, that this is really useful work to be able to take it on. I just don't feel I have the expertise in writing either for a philosophical audience or for a sociological or scientific audience. I might be able to write a lay book, but I think that might have to be where I would take it. And as far as sourcing further papers is concerned, I don't know what I'll do from here on in.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that you are well qualified to write for many audiences. I really appreciated this talk and having a framework to work off of. We have 3 questions right now, so I'll take them in the order that they came. So first, how about Martha? Can you share your question with us, please?
Hi. So, hi. Thank you very much for, it was really a great talk. I have so many questions, it's hard to untangle them. But it's just kind of brave of you to take the road of, you know what, this is, I start a program and you know what, this is not what I want, and then going independent. I think that's really cool. Anyways, you hinted already at the sort of cultural hegemony that came with European imperialism. And I think my question sort of related to the one in the chat, because I thought also about not just how cultures, like we have at the moment as sort of as an hegemonic culture to go with, but I also wonder if you've also sort of looked into the way that hierarchization of cultures has been historically weaponized, especially in related to colonialism, because I mean, it was explicitly said at the time that those who were to be enslaved or subjugated had either no culture or lesser cultures. And so I wonder, what is the relationship there between what was done to colonize peoples and what became now the debate about whether or not animals are, you know, good enough to have cultures?
Marta, thank you so much for that question. And I think it's a really important one. And it's so important that that I didn't want to sort of like skate over it in this. In my paper, in the version of the paper, I've written, you know, I'm not, this paper doesn't address what significance this may have to human cultures, because again, I didn't want to go into it. But I think that the point you're making is entirely valid. And I think that that's hierarchy. We're making up a word, aren't we? Hierarchicalization of cultures, with this sort of like European colonialism at the top and everything else below. That is the sort of same paradigm. And from a lot of work that people have done on indigenous cultures, whether Native American, Australian, and in the Indian subcontinent as well, all of those cultural practices are very different with the way that they regard you know, humanity versus the more than human world. And so I think that someone coming from those traditions would have a different take on the way that I've presented this. And I think that would be a very interesting area to explore and to examine. It was something that I didn't feel particularly qualified to do. And I also didn't want to get into the area of because this, with animal rights, it can become very difficult. Does this mean that then you say Inuit people, because it's their cultural tradition to harpoon whales, that means that Inuit people are allowed to harpoon whales and people in Japan who aren't? And all of those sort of like human cultural framings I felt were sort of beyond my pay grade, and it needed someone who had explored the areas a lot more to go into them. But the point that you're making, I think it would make a fascinating paper and discussion and exploration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think that you really touched on Susan's question in the chat, but I do want to read it in case it sparks anything else that you might want to say. Susan asks, it seems like anthropologists have long been identifying the concept of animal cultures as central to some human cultures, but why do you think they hesitate to claim a more universal idea that humans and other animals share cultures as a basic condition of life?
Oh, well, let me just have to slow my thinking. human cultures, but why do you think they've hesitated to claim a more universal idea that humans? Yes, that is interesting. I think it's, Susan, I think maybe perhaps it's one of these other bastions of human exceptionalism, that, you know, oh, we're not the only ones that make tools, darn, we're not the only ones who have language, darn, and so this idea of, well, you know, we are the really cultural animals, or we're the storytelling animals, you know, now looks as if that could be the next one. But then you've got humpback whales, who maybe are greater storytellers than we are, who knows. I think it may be something to do with that, and I also think that I thought about this when I was writing a long time ago about Dracula, and the idea of Gothic fiction in the Victorian time was this dreadful fear of the other. So there was Britain at the time that was a sort of strong empire, and you have this sort of fear of the other. So you impose all this sort of like sexuality and rapaciousness and immorality onto these alien figures, that vampires or whatever else. And I think that we are very afraid of the idea that we could take on the aspects of another culture, that another culture could sort of teach us something, that our culture could be porous to something else. And when I think about the cultural relationships, the social familial relationships between wolves and killer whales, orcas, both of which have been explored a great deal, and with orcas particularly, the percentage size of the relevant, you know, brain compartments, not that I'm a big fan of, you know, the size of a brain meaning something, but there does seem to be the suggestion that emotional life and relationship connections are supremely important to orcas and to wolves. And I think that we as humans resist the idea that they could be better than us in any way, and consequently we don't like to see it as culture. We see it as emotional bonds, rather than the way that a culture has developed these important ties that can establish a sense of meaning, of how you garner knowledge, of how you organize your society, and that are also about emotion. And I think we want to just say, oh, it's just something that's purely emotional, not it's something cultural. Because if it's cultural, then it's like, oh, wait a second, well, why don't we care that much about our grandparents? I don't think I answered that very clearly.
No, you did. I'd also add in too, Susan, that I see it as well as an issue for the human-based social sciences, where you can't essentialize, right? So there's that tension between essentializing versus constructing. And so these scholars that Susan mentioned are looking at this or that culture and saying, this is how this or that culture construct these relationships and view these relationships. But I think what's needed is something along the lines, Issy, of what you're doing, which is to do not an ethnology, but an ethnography that compares and pulls in a bunch of different cultures where humans and animals interrelate, so that you could come up with something that said there's something that holds these all together. And what that is that animals have culture, right? So you're taking what they're doing further and looking more broadly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I know we have at least 2 more questions in our last 10 minutes here. Emily, could you ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. This was amazing. Thank you so much, Isabella. I just first want to say you are an academic. Like, I mean, just because you might not be tied to an institution, like, you know, especially, you know, with what you're doing with kind of, I don't know, looking beyond the ways that we normally, or the norms around thinking about different things like culture. I think the same can be said for, academia, right? Like you've done this work, you've created something that is, it's a new way of thinking about the world. And so, yeah, I think that you are an academic, and that the possibilities are endless in terms of how you want to take this out into the world. I would, first of all, I would love to connect with you, or second of all, I'd love to connect with you. I'm an EDV student exploring animal agency and adult human education, and I think we'd have a great chat. So I'll be sending you an email. So one thing that I was really excited about, with your point about, these constructs of like aggression and dominance, and how you mentioned that we have these, we're seeing that these behaviors, and thus these kind of constructs that we're labeling them as, through our own biases and perspectives, and we're bringing in our own like cultural narratives around these different behaviors that we're observing. And again, like these are, obviously, like things like dominance and like hierarchies. These are, at least human constructs, right? At least, these ideas. And so I'm curious to know like what your thoughts are on like how we move forward. Like how do we move out of labeling like animal relationships in these ways, so that we can see them hopefully from a perspective that is less biased, and to really, create space to see animals as they are, to the best of our ability, recognizing that there are limitations, of course. So I'm just kind of curious to know like what your thoughts are on I guess where we go from here. How do we inspire more people across more disciplines to be critically thinking about these different ways of seeing other animals. And then kind of a second question, which you don't have to necessarily answer because I know this is a lot, but I'm also curious to know, how do we disseminate this information beyond academic audiences? How do we, like the backyard birder, or, the people with companion animals, or, in the context of our relationships with other animals, like how do we inspire them to change, to see their relationships differently, based on your own experience?
I think that second one is hugely important, and it's something that I have been thinking about, haven't come up with any answers on the sort of dominance and hierarchies side. I think this is also very, very interesting. So John A. Livingston talks about conciliation, and I think about my garden, that when the birds are feeding, I duck so that I don't scare them out of the way, and I don't go out. They have the garden. Now, you could, if you were from Mars and you were looking at me, you could say, oh well, the birds have a dominance over this person, so obviously, in this case. But that isn't the case. There's a kind of reverence and a cooperation and an equitable sharing going on. And I think that those kind of experiences are actually not infrequent in the way that we interact with others. It's just that as soon as we look at animals, we have this view that, oh, they couldn't possibly be that sophisticated. They couldn't possibly be that nuanced, that it would have to be, I'm beating you over the head with a club. And so I think that it is possible to sort of to look at things differently. I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of cases of dominance, but it's just a reminder not to go always for the easy answer. And on the dissemination, I think it is really interesting. And and I don't know whether things like YouTube and podcasts and I read recently about Kids for Wolves, that a schoolgirl, an American schoolgirl started, which has so many followers on Instagram, and she ended up getting a presidential award from Barack Obama. I suppose part of the problem is that people of my generation are kind of not necessarily as well placed as possible to understand what the best media avenues are for the sort of what is it going to be, the 21st century or 22nd? What century are we in? It's not the 18th, I know that. I hope that helps, and do get in touch. It would be wonderful to connect.
I think we only have time for one more question. Marta, I see your hands up. If you want to enter your question into the chat, and I see another question on the chat, because what I'm going to do after is send Izzy the chat log so that, and you can reach out via email. I also put her email in the email chat log so that maybe you could finish these conversations later. Huda, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name correctly, but you mentioned that you did want to ask a question. So if you could come on and ask your question, and please tell us how to pronounce your name, how to say your name, because names are important, that would be fabulous. You'll just have to unmute yourself. I'm not sure if we should be hearing you, but we can't, but I see that you did unmute. Okay, we cannot hear you. So while we have a little bit of time, I'm just going to go to the next question in the chat. How do you stay motivated when you continue to see human cultures continue to unilaterally disrupt animal habitats? We devalue other animals due to a plethora of justifications. So it must be frustrating to see us collectively be even more dismissive with animals and insects.
And who is that from?
Again, I might pronounce this wrong, but
Amuri.
Yeah.
That's I don't know. The answer. I write a blog, which my friend Ellie, who's here at this talk today, is my one loyal reader. But the post I wrote today was just all about sort of like feelings of disgust and despair. I suppose that what happens is I live on the edge of a town. It's not a very nice town, and the countryside is all farmland. And so, you know, it's not exactly hugely animal rich. We've killed off all of our top predators. The biggest one is a badger. It's yay big. And but I go into these little bits of land that have been left over where it was too difficult for farmers to plow, and I crawl through hedges and I get inside these little places and I sit with a tree, and if I sit there for long enough, maybe something happens, like I see a hare shadow boxing at me in the distance and sort of like staying around, and I feel renewal and love and the blessing of being granted the presence of the more than human world for those minutes. And I leave some peanuts or something as an offering, and I go home, and for a few hours I feel okay.
Thank you for that very honest and real answer. Before we leave today, I put in the chat the flyer for our next talk. And I think that this next talk is doing some of the work that Izzy's asking us to do, specifically with cats. And it's asking us to, it's about coexistence with community cats. And I believe that our speaker, Irina Frazen, is here today as well. And she'll be asking us to actually watch and pay attention and look at and respect these cats, and that will help us reimagine. I haven't seen the talk yet, so I might be misrepresenting some of it, but hopefully that can help us reimagine our relationship with these cats. And Irina is coming to us out of Romania. So we've been really blessed to make this really an international community through these colloquiums. And so thank you everyone who came today. Please grab that flyer and make sure you come next month. And a really huge thank you to you, Izzy, for this wonderful work that you have shared with us. I will be sending a recording of this to everyone who registered for this event. So you will have that later, and I will also attach that flyer to that email, so you'll have that information as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening attentively and for your wonderful questions. And please do get in touch. I would love to feel I'm in a community rather than a lone non-academic all on my own.
Bye everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Izzy. Thank you, Carol.